Burning Issy, Melvin Burgess, Chapter 13. 1 month after I came to Iron's house, we had visitors. Iron was counting bales of cloth with me in one of the outhouses when Tolly came and told her that 2 men were here to see her. I could tell from his look that it was trouble. They were waiting on their horses outside the house. I recognised them at once. Parson Holden nodded gravely at me as I came into sight. The other was Baldwin, the church warden who'd been made witch finder. He sat stiffly on his horse, holding it tightly by the brindle so it tossed its head irritably. His face was still cold as he watched Iron walk up to them. He didn't wait for her to speak. "We've come for the girl," he said. Iron's eyebrows went up. "Is that so?" she said. The man leant over his horse and pointed his finger at his face. He said, "Witch." Iron glared sullenly at him. I glanced at Parson Holden and he nodded grimly. "There's a nasty stink about here," said Iron. "Burned flesh and broken bones, a stink of hell." "You will be in hell very soon," he replied, as if he were stating a known fact. "Mr. Priest wishes to save your pupil from the rope. He seems to think her soul is not yet lost. That is not my opinion." "I want to speak to Issy," put in Parson Holden. "I take it you have no objection." Iron glanced at me. "If she wants to, the girl isn't mine or yours." "Certainly not God's," said the thin man in a jeering voice. Iron ignored him. "Will you speak with the parson?" she asked me. I looked at her to see what she wanted and added, "Why not? Go ahead. At least he looks as if he's had some practice smiling." Parson Holden dismounted and I led him away to a bench under some fruit trees a little way off. He sat and looked at me grimly before beckoning me to sit by him. "How is my father and Gil?" I asked him as I sat down. "Both in good health," he replied, "but in very great danger." "What's happened?" He peered anxiously into my face. He looked tired and frightened, and I thought, poor man, all alone in a witch's house. He must feel terrible. "Pendle is all up against the witches," he told me. "They already have Demdike, Lizzie and Alison in jail. God knows what, I can't get this name right, Baldwin will extract from them. That man," he nodded back at the house where we'd left Iron and the witch finder. "I've seen his work. I don't think the justice in Lancaster knew what he was doing when they let him loose in Pendle." He shook his head miserably. "Every poor old woman is a witch these days. All it takes is an accusation to be arrested, and once he gets his hand on them..." He shrugged. Excuse me. "Has someone accused Nat?" "Not yet. It could happen soon the way things are." "I have to go and see them. Issy, you would be certain death to them. You're a living living with a known witch." I shook my head, but he nodded firmly. "Iron Star is known for miles around as a witch. Just that she stayed in your father's house might be enough to condemn them. Little she cared. As for you, living here is madness." "I don't believe it." He shook his head impatiently. "For her it's only a matter of time. She's known all over the county. It's an open secret. You can't tell me you've spent 3 weeks in this house without realising that." I looked at the table, shook my head sulkily. "Issy, listen to me. I've come all this way for your sake. Your only chance is to confess. Tell the truth and I'll do everything I can for you." "And what is the truth?" I asked bitterly. "That you are a witch, that Iron Star is a witch, that Jeanette and Demdike and her family are all witches." "Iron saved Gil's life. She saved me from Demdike. Is that the devil's work?" "She has sold her soul. Her powers come from hell. Don't you understand? The The devil doesn't care. She does good or bad so long as she renounces God and gives him her soul. She told me she doesn't worship the devil, I protested. He grimaced. Then she has been deceived, he said. Never forget the cunning of the devil. There's no lie you will not tell to win a soul. You poor child. You think you've been rescued, but you're in worse danger than ever. You must confess. You must testify against her. Would they hang her? And little Jeanette too? They will hang her. All of them. Mistress Assal, Demdike, little Jeanette, fair or foul, young or old, with your help or without it, and they'll hang you too, if you don't do as I say. I can't betray my friends, I pleaded. These creatures you call friends, they're barely humans anymore. They have no souls. They're monsters. And you're a witch too, Issy, I'm certain of it. Someone sold your soul when you were too young to remember it. Probably this very witch you call your friend. But you were young, and you didn't know what you were doing. You haven't abandoned God, and he hasn't abandoned you. Remember that. God will never abandon his children. He will forgive everything, so long as you truly repent and confess. For you, there's still hope. I will testify you, but you must help me. Do you understand me, Issy? I've come all this way to try and save your life. He took hold of my hand, and I stared intently at me as he spoke. Now he turned the hand over to find the mark on my wrist where he burned me with the candle. God forgive me for that, he murmured, touching the spot gently with his finger. This man, Badwin, he worships the same God as I do, but there's no love in him. If you fall into his hands, God help you. He will have your iron before the month's out. Even a witch doesn't deserve that. He sighed unhappily. Well, Issy, are you with me? I know it's hard, but it's the only way. I thought of all the strange things that had happened since I met Ihan. The creatures I'd seen in the garden, the cures, the way she treated Demdike. I thought of that fire she'd shown me. I knew that Parson Holden would make of that. If I told him about it, hell's fire, he'd say. I thought of the misery of Thursday nights. Parson Holden was right. I thought of the mystery of her Thursday nights. Parson Holden was right. Ihan was surely a witch, although a very different one from Demdike. Very likely so was I. But even the fear of hell was not enough to make me betray her. Not yet. I shook my head. Then you're lost, he said quietly. He kissed my hand and blessed me. God save you, Issy, he said. You're a good girl, I know that, but your soul is not your own, and you lack the courage to take it back. I'll pray that when the end comes, it'll be quick for you. If you change your mind, my house is always open for you. Remember that. He rose up and walked back to the house, leaving me sitting on the bench in the sunshine, surrounded by Ihan's flowers. I'd never felt so miserable. There was no haven for me. Even Ihan was turning to poison. There was nowhere for me to turn away from danger. At the back of my mind, I heard the two men speaking to Ihan, and an argument grew up. They were shouting. Ihan let out a yell, and then there was a cracking slap, followed by a great thud. I jumped up, rushed over to see what had happened. Badwin was picking himself up off the dirt with a look of pure venom on his face. Ihan was in a tremendous fury. She was coming at him again, and she would have kicked his head off if Tolly hadn't run across and pulled her back. Parson Holden held Badwin to his feet. Baldwin even to his feet. The side of the man's face was bright red when she struck him. From the way he'd scurried away from her boot, she'd already given him the kick of his life. Ihan shook Tolly off. Never speak to any woman like that again, she hissed. Her face was livid with anger. Where do you get your filthy poison from? Not God, surely. The witch-finder limped over to his horse and crawled up it. It was a great big animal with muddy frills of hair around its huge feet and wide shoulders. Once he was up above, Baldwin found his courage again. "You'll pay for that," he spat, wiping the mud off his face. He looked like a small angry bird perched up there on this great beast. Iron glared up at him as he pulled up the reins and trotted a few metres down the track. And then he turned and said suddenly, "Show me your hands, witch." I felt her quiver by my side, and I turned to look at her. It was the only time I'd ever seen Iron at a loss for words. She lifted her hands up as if they were not part of her, but some precious possession, and held them loosely below her throat. She had turned grey. Her lips moved, but no words came out. The thin man nodded with a hard little smile of pleasure. "The witch remembers," he said. "When you come before me, I shall remember this." I noticed Holden looking at him with an expression of disgust as he turned his horse again. They were both trotting off down the track when I had suddenly found a voice. "I can remember what they did to the hands of Jesus Christ," she said. The witch-finder dragged his horse round and snarled at her. "Do you compare yourself to the Lord Witch?" "No," she answered. "I compare you to his murderers." The thin man went white. I held my breath at her nerve. His wife became a thin knife slash in his face, and he fought to control himself before he was able to answer. "It's God's work, God's work," she jeered. "Where in the gospel does our Lord tear the living flesh of his enemies? You have been deceived, but you will answer for your crimes against nature in hell." To be threatened by a witch with hell was too much. He swore and dragged the horse round to her face so violently that he tore its mouth with the bit. Frightened and bleeding, the animal reared, slashed the air and tried to turn from her, but he wrenched it back and drove in his spurs. The horse whined. Prance cut the air with its hooves once more and then suddenly bounded forward directly at Iron. The thin man lifted his whip. Iron, tiny and frail underneath those huge hooves, raised her arm to her face. "Don't!" I heard myself shout. I ran forward. Somewhere at the back of my head, I heard a roar of the blaze of the fire. I felt the power flow into me with smooth, sudden movement, so wide and broad that it filled me up in a second, and then paused, waiting for the moment of release. I lifted my arms up, pushed them forward towards the horse and kept the fire, and the fire leapt from my fingers, rushed out of me in one great surge, a wave of power. For a second I saw horse and rider caught in an inferno, blazing and screaming. There was a smell of burnt hair, and then the fire lifted them right into the air, like a branch of wood going over a wave. The horse found itself suddenly up on its hind legs. It pranced, tried to jump forward but could not, hung for a second on tiptoes and then tumbled backwards into the dirt. It crashed right into the bed of marigolds by the side of the track and began thrashing and whining, kicking clods of earth everywhere as it tried to regain its feet. The fire stopped. There was a blue haze in the air. The whole thing had taken just a few seconds. I thought for a second it had been a dream, but where the horse was struggling to its feet, there was the witch-finder rolling over his back among the flowers to avoid being crushed. The smell of singed hair was still in the air, and I saw how the skin on his face had turned bright, angry red. The horse clambered up on his feet and fled off down the yard, its mane smouldering. The man picked himself up for the second time, his eyes fixed on me, his face grey with fear, blotched red with burns. I took a step forward toward him and he backed away, screaming at me, crossing himself. Parson Holden came up from behind and snatched him into his saddle. As they galloped off, I could see the thin man's face was staring backwards at me. "Witch! Witch!" he screamed in a high boy's voice. Then the horse swerved before the fence, steadied, jumped and cleared it. They disappeared before the trees lining the road beyond our land. As the drumming of the horse hoofs disappeared, everything went very quiet. I saw Iron looking at me, and Tolly, who shook his head and glanced up and down to the road to see if anyone was watching. Iron laughed with delight, seized my hand and dragged me after her into the house. End of chapter 13. There are 19 chapters, by the way. Okay, thank you.